Today on Dark Tower, the Scott Peterson murders. Laci Peterson was a 27-year-old pregnant woman who went missing on December 24th, 2002, from her home in Modesto, California, United States. She was 8 months pregnant with a son whom she and her husband, Scott Peterson, planned to name Connor. The disappearance of Laci Peterson gained widespread attention and quickly became a high-profile case. Search efforts were launched involving law enforcement agencies, volunteers, and the media. The story received extensive coverage, with news outlets following the investigation closely. Laci was born May 4th, 1975, and lived near Escalon, California. She attended California Polytechnic State University, majoring in ornamental horticulture. Scott was born October 24th, 1972 in San Diego, California. He began playing golf at an early age, and by age 14, he could beat his father at the game. For a time, Scott had dreams of becoming a professional golfer, and he was teammates with future pro Phil Mickelson at the University of San Diego High School. By the end of high school, he was one of the top junior golfers in San Diego. Scott went to Cuesta College and then to California Polytechnic State University. Initially planning to major in international business, Scott ultimately graduated with a degree in agricultural business. Professors who taught Scott described him as a model student. His agribusiness professor, Jim Ahern, commented, "I wouldn't mind having a class full of Scott Petersons." In 1994, Laci met Scott at a cafe where he worked in Morro Bay. Laci told her mother that she had just met the man she would marry. They soon began dating, and they married in 1997. They eventually moved to Modesto, California in 2000. Laci's family, including her mother and younger sister, related that she devoted much of her energy towards being the perfect housewife, enjoying cooking, entertaining, and watching Martha Stewart. In 2002, Laci discovered she was pregnant. Her due date was February 10th, 2003. The couple had planned to name their son Connor. In November 2002, Scott was introduced by a friend to Amber Frey, a Fresno massage therapist, and the two began a romantic relationship. On December 23rd, 2002, at 5:45 p.m., Laci and Scott went to Salon, the workplace of Laci's sister, Amy Rocha, where Amy cut Scott's hair as she did each month. Scott told people that he would play golf on the day of Christmas Eve. Laci's mother, Sharon, spoke with Laci on the telephone around 8:30 that evening. The last three people known to have spoken to Laci before she disappeared were Amy, Sharon, and Scott. Scott later told police that he last saw his wife at 9:30 a.m. on December 24th, when he left to go fishing at the Berkeley Marina. He said Laci was doing housework, baking, and watching a Martha Stewart cooking show, and would later walk the dog. A neighbor of Peterson's stated that she found the Petersons' dog, a golden retriever named Mackenzie, alone outside the home and returned him to the Petersons' backyard at around 10:30 a.m. That neighbor put the dog in the Petersons' yard, not observing that anything was out of place. At 2:15 p.m., Scott left a message for Laci stating, "Hey beautiful, it's 2:15. I'm leaving Berkeley." Scott said he returned home that afternoon finding Laci's car in the driveway and the house empty and the dog in the backyard. Scott showered and washed his clothes. A neighbor of Scott's later said that Scott had knocked on his door asking if he had seen Laci, and also said that he had been golfing that day and tried to call Laci. A relative of Laci's would later testify that when friends and family began gathering at the Peterson home that night, Scott said that he had gone to play golf. Scott called his mother-in-law, Sharon, to ask if Laci was with her. Sharon said that call was when she learned Laci was missing. Scott and Laci's stepfathers both reported Laci missing. The police received the report of her disappearance shortly before 6 p.m. At the time of her disappearance, Laci was 7.5 months pregnant, with a due date of February 10, 2003. The couple had planned to name the baby boy Connor. The story quickly attracted nationwide media interest. Modesto police detectives Alan Brocchini and John Bueller were the head investigators on the case. When they arrived at the Petersons' home, Laci's keys, wallet, and sunglasses were found in her purse in a closet. Bueller later told ABC News, "I suspected Scott when I first met him. I was a little thrown off by his calm, cool demeanor and his lack of questioning." Bueller further described Scott's behavior as strange, a combination of polite and arrogant. He was distant and impatiently irritable. He just didn't seem like a man who was greatly disturbed by his wife's disappearance and possible death. After Scott told the police that he had gone to fish for sturgeon at the Berkeley Marina, about 90 miles from the couple's Modesto home, detectives immediately launched a search. Though the police later said they suspected foul play almost immediately, they did not treat the case as suspicious within the first few hours after the missing persons report was filed. During this period, Scott's in-laws defended him and portrayed him and Laci as the ideal couple, and public perception of Scott reflected this. As police continued to investigate, they grew more suspicious of Scott. On January 17, 2003, it became known that Scott had engaged in 2 other extramarital affairs prior to an affair with a woman named Amber Frey. Frey informed police of their relationship on December 30, 2002, shortly after discovering Scott was a person of interest in Laci's disappearance. She told detectives that she met Scott on November 20th and that he had initially told her he was single. She also informed police that Scott had told her on December 9th, 2 weeks prior to Laci's disappearance, he was a widower, and it would be the first Christmas without his wife. This was probably an indication that Scott had already decided to kill Laci. Frey agreed to phone him while police recorded her subsequent phone conversations with Scott in the hopes of getting him to confess. After knowing about his extramarital affairs, the Rocha family publicly withdrew their support of Scott on January 24, 2003. Within a month, Scott would no longer be communicating with the Rocha family. Modesto police and firefighters carried out an extensive search along Dry Creek the day after Laci's disappearance. The search came to include helicopters, police mounted on horseback and bicycles, and canine units and water rescue units on rafts. Laci's loved ones and volunteers also helped in the search, posting flyers to raise awareness of her disappearance. In the first 2 days, up to 900 people were involved in the looking for Laci. Eventually, a $500,000 reward was offered for any information leading to Laci's safe return. On April 13, 2003, the remains of a well-preserved male fetus washed ashore along the bay's coastline, just a few miles from where Scott had been fishing. A day later, the badly decomposed body of a woman was found about a mile away from where the fetus was found. It is thought the fetus was well preserved because the uterus was still intact and protected it before it was expelled. The remains were later identified as those of Laci Peterson and her unborn son, Connor. Autopsies revealed that Laci had died before her body was disposed of in the bay. The exact cause of death could not be determined conclusively due to decomposition, but it was believed to be the result of an asphyxiation. The fetus had also died as a result of the incident before being born. The FBI and Modesto Police Department performed forensic searches of the Peterson home. The FBI also conducted mitochondrial DNA testing on a hair from pliers found in Scott's fishing boat that linked them with hairs recovered from Laci's hairbrush. The authorities also searched Scott's pickup truck, toolbox, warehouse, and boat. They found a homemade anchor in the boat Scott purchased 2 weeks earlier. Prosecutors believed that Scott made 5 anchors and used 4 of them to sink Laci's body in San Francisco Bay. After Scott was arrested, police conducted further searches in the bay in an attempt to locate the anchors, but nothing was found. Scott Peterson was arrested on April 18, 2003, near a La Jolla golf course. where he said he was meeting his father and brother for a game of golf. His naturally dark brown hair had been dyed blonde, and his Mercedes was overstuffed with miscellaneous items, including nearly $15,000 in cash, 12 Viagra tablets, survival gear, camping equipment, several changes of clothes, 4 cell phones, and 2 driver's licenses, those being his and his brother's. Scott's father, Lee Peterson, explained that Scott had used his brother's license the day before to get a San Diego resident discount at the golf course, and that Scott had been living out of his car because of the media attention. Police and prosecutors, however, saw these items as an indication that Scott had planned to flee to Mexico. He was charged with 2 felony counts of murder with premeditation and special circumstances. Stanislaus County Superior Court moved his trial to San Mateo County because of the concern so many people in Stanislaus had made up their minds about Scott's guilt. Scott's trial began on June 1st, 2004. During the trial, the defense maintained Scott's innocence and questioned the validity of the evidence presented by the prosecution. The defense team argued that there were other possible suspects and that Scott had been unfairly targeted due to the media bias and public opinion. The prosecution argued that Scott had killed Laci to escape the responsibilities of marriage and impending fatherhood and to be with his mistress, Amber Frey. They presented evidence that included wiretapped phone conversations between Scott and Amber, in which Scott had lied about his marital status and the circumstances surrounding Laci's disappearance. Lacking direct evidence to link Scott to the crime, prosecutors chiefly relied on circumstantial evidence, pointing in particular to Scott's behavior before and after Laci's disappearance. Sharon Rocha testified that when she went to Berkeley Marina to search for Laci, she saw Scott there, but she said Scott did not acknowledge her calling out to him, and that he later angled away from her attempts to hug him, and did not attend a candlelight vigil. Relatives of Laci said Scott had shown little emotion during Laci's disappearance, and 3 witnesses testified that Scott had told them that he had been golfing, not fishing, after Laci's disappearance. The prosecution called on various witnesses to establish that Scott changed his appearance, purchased a vehicle using his mother's name, and added 2 pornographic television channels to his cable service days after his wife's disappearance. A realtor testified that in a January 22, 2003 phone call, Scott expressed interest in selling their home. A car salesman testified that Scott had traded in Laci's Land Rover for a Dodge pickup truck. Frey testified as to her affair with Scott, and the jury heard the secretly recorded telephone calls between the pair. In one, recorded after Laci disappeared, Scott falsely said he was in Paris. After a highly publicized trial, which lasted several months, Scott Peterson was found guilty on November 12, 2004. He was convicted of first-degree murder for the death of Laci Peterson and second-degree murder for the death of their unborn child. In March 2005, Scott Peterson was sentenced to death by lethal injection. On September 22, 2021, California Superior Court Judge Ann Christine Mosulo ruled that Scott would be resentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. In October 2022, Scott was moved off San Quentin's death row and transferred to Mule Creek State Prison in Ione, California. The case had a significant impact on public discourse and media coverage surrounding high-profile criminal cases, especially those involving pregnant women. It highlighted issues of infidelity, motive, and the complexities of the criminal justice system.